Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on space mobility. Today, we're going to have a really interesting conversation covering the commercial ISAM sector in space mobility, satellite servicing, a bunch of different applications in this space. We're going to talk about how the DoD is creating new opportunities and what the DoD and NASA and other government agencies domestically and abroad are looking for in this sector. We're also the Space Mobility Conference was last week, so we're going to kind of cover some of the key themes. Particularly helpful if you didn't attend the conference. This is a good 40-minute update on it, but we're going to have a nice, broad, interesting conversation today. To introduce myself, my name is Jack Kuhr, and I'm the research director at Payload. So there is a question Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. Please feel free to just plop questions into that box. Often we just kind of move away from my questions and just go right into Q&A discussion. So always look for a engaged audience. But with that, we have a great three panelists today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves first. Quick programming note. Claire, we originally were going to have Claire Martin from Astroscale on the panel, but she is not feeling well today. But luckily, we get Jack to take her place. And with that, we can go around the horn. Maybe Jack will have you go last for Astroscale, but maybe we'll start with you, Ryan, if you can introduce yourself and benchmark.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan McDevitt, I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Benchmark Space Systems. We build chemical and electric in-space mobility solutions to help with maneuvering in space logistics, and then deorbit. So really excited to be on the panel. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks, Jack, and thanks, Payload, for the opportunity. I'm Steve Jordan Tomaszewski, the Vice President for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association. We're a trade association that represents over 300 companies across the aerospace and defense industry.
Yeah, hi, Jack. Jack Deasy here. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development for Astroscale US. We're a Denver-based company delivering on-orbit servicing solutions for national security, civil space, and commercial operators. We are focused on all the logistics that we are accustomed to on Earth, moving, maintenance, sustainment, bringing them into orbit where they've been lacking, and the satellites have not had the advantages of having those services. So space mobility is obviously central to everything we do, and really excited to be here to join this panel today and talk about what was, I think, a really positive event.
Cool. Awesome. And for the first question, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which I'm curious if this was brought up at Space Mobility. So the night before the Space Mobility Conference, there was a Breaking Defense article that reported, initial reporting, so we really don't know what's true or not true, and I think it's important to qualify this reporting based off of it, but the initial reporting was that the Space Force is zeroing out, whatever that means, zeroing out the line item for space mobility funding. And Steve, maybe I'll have you answer this question first, but how should the industry interpret this? And can you contextualize this article, this report, and the funding dynamics here?
Sure, Jack. So I think a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, let's just remind everyone where we are in the federal budget cycle. We're currently operating under a continuing resolution, which has been in place since the start of fiscal year 2025, which started last October in 2024. The continuing resolution does expire next month, and a lot of lawmakers and folks around the industry are hoping we'll finally get a finalized appropriation bill that will lock in federal government funding for fiscal year 2025. What happens as well, though, is even though that Congress is still working on finalizing fiscal year 2025 appropriations, they're already working on the next year's, and that's fiscal year 2026. So that wouldn't start until October of 2025, later this year. But the report was talking about how that fiscal year 2026 proposal is coming along. And in order to build the budget, especially from a Department of Defense standpoint, as the article was talking about a specific Space Force line, you have the Department of Defense that creates an initial proposal. They send it over to the White House and the Office of Management and Budget that reviews that and eventually sends it over to Capitol Hill. That usually happens in February for getting the next fiscal year and plenty of time to debate that. But usually during a presidential transition year like we are in right now, there's usually a delay that happens. So we'll see how President Trump and his team decide to send over their president's budget request for fiscal year 2026 over to the Hill. And a lot could change. I asked a particular question to a Space Force leader that was part of the conference about this particular line. And just for more context, in 2025, there was about $20 million that was set aside for space access, mobility, and logistics. But the Space Force leader said there's still a lot of decisions to get made. And even after the president submits his budget request over to Capitol Hill, Congress is going to weigh in on that and pass the final appropriations, right? So even if it didn't came through as a $0 request or taking the line from $20 million in fiscal year 2025 down to zero, Congress could still put a plus up in there. So I think that the last piece of context for this is, talking about $20 million is a lot of money, but if you put that in the greater context of the Space Force's budget, which is almost $30 billion, or the overall Department of Defense budget, which is approaching $900 billion. This is a small step to try to unpack these new types of capabilities.
Okay, just a quick follow-up question: is it so 20 million is relatively pretty small? So could it be that ISAM or servicing or space mobility funding can be in a different bucket that's wrapped up in a different application? Is that kind of, we don't know much right now, but is that a possibility?
Absolutely. If you look at the opportunities to where you could see a specific funding for mobility, access, and logistics types of activities, it could be in a bunch of different places. It could be under certain prototype contracts. It could be part of organizations and grants from organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit. It could be a specific Space Force line item, or it could be something that is invested from different parts of the space enterprise, such as parts of NASA, or even over in the intelligence community. So lots of options. And what we're kind of talking about here is just one particular line item in the Space Force's budget.
Okay, great. Yeah, I want to bring Jack in here from Astroscale. This has been, in-space mobility has been one of the strongest demand signals sent from the DoD in the last couple of years. And there was this space mobility conference. So just want to maybe get your key highlights from this conference. I think it was last week, maybe even last Tuesday or something. And what was the general sentiment? What was some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a really great conference. General Panelists opened the conference with a sort of comprehensive explanation of all the things that Space Force is doing to support launch as a key element of assured access to space. And I think it was really broad. It was all sorts of elements that together with allowing Space Force to deliver a much increased tempo of launch. That was followed up by General John Shaw delivering a keynote with a lot of good context about how to think about the emerging space environment and where we are sort of historically and what's coming next. And one of his key points was that space mobility is more than just launch and assured access to space. And I think those two pieces really together encapsulate why space mobility as a conference has become a sort of key place for a lot of us interested in on-orbit services to explore emerging capabilities, emerging requirements, and what needs to be done to support the warfighter.
Great. And Ryan, I can bring you in too on that. Maybe if we can talk about what Benchmark is seeing, and what are these emerging capabilities, and maybe just kind of give context of how Benchmark plays in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of interesting things that, Steve and Jack have mentioned that kind of ties this all together, right? So, this idea that any, individual funding is not necessarily indicative of the Space Force's intent or DoD's intent. I mean, that kind of plays into like we're seeing active demand. We are talking to both government customers, commercial customers who are supporting government customers on hardware and products that support in-space logistics, on-orbit maneuver, all of these different pieces. So to our mind, like that article, whether or not and Steve pointed out, like we're so far in the future, it's maybe irrelevant, but that's not at all what we're seeing from a demand signal and how we're supporting. And then, kind of talking about what Jack was mentioning, one of the big topics that we saw, and that's kind of consistent, has been the consistent messaging in other conferences, and then again at this conference, is this idea that the Space Force and DoD do not want to be the only customer for this. They do not want to be the market setters for it. And so for Benchmark, the way that we think about this is we're building hardware products, hardware and software that support it, that help with problems that you need to solve today. So we build propulsion products is our core, bread and butter. So chemical propulsion all the way down from, 1 Newton to help a small spacecraft move around up through 22 Newton and beyond. And then electric down in the micronewton scale, helping you do things like precision pointing, CubeSat, maneuvering. But really where this plays into this conversation and how you can advance the state of the art is when you put all of these pieces together and control it with the software that we're building around our guidance, navigation, and control to support propulsive maneuvers. Now you can start doing some interesting things that support different opportunities, on-orbit refueling, on-orbit servicing, and one of the ones that we're working on right now that we think is interesting and is kind of this good example of NASA setting forth a goal. We need to be more responsive to deorbit. We came up with a proposal for a deorbit device that is more cost effective in certain applications than others. But we needed a partner for that because that's not our area of expertise. Astroscale US, we reached out and said, hey, you guys are experts in this and have had an opportunity to kind of work on that. And I see that as kind of this, for us, that build of one, you need to have a commercial base. The government is not going to be the only customer for us for to do this. And so we are working on how do we do this, but also how can we intercept what specific government needs are. I mentioned a NASA one, we're working on other DoD ones as well. And we see this as a partnership plan that grows with the industry and grows with our partners. So a lot of generalities there, but like as far as the specifics, it's just it's that build, it's that slow, steady build for us.
And just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, just throw it in the Q&A chat below. But just on that commercial piece, so Ryan, you're Benchmark is a commercial partner, and you're going to partner with another commercial business, being Astroscale. But then Astroscale needs to find, if we're going to have this be a commercial ecosystem, it needs to find perhaps not just a government end user, government demand, but also a commercial demand. So Jack, I want to pull you in and see if you have any. What are your thoughts on the commercial end applications versus just purely DoD and NASA and government revenue?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a great question and Ryan is really identifying it. And going back to sort of the article that we started discussing, right? Great reporting draws attention to key issues, right? And that's really what this did. Timing was great. You had everybody in one place. I think the reaction on the ground, and people talked about the report a lot, really reflected two things. One of them is all of us as private commercial companies are largely in the still private investor space. Astroscale is a publicly held company, but a lot of companies aren't. In both cases, very dependent on private investment, believing in what we're doing. It's early technology, doing new things. So clear, consistent demand signal from DoD about what they do want, what they do need, is really important for on-orbit servicing, as it has always been for commercial space across the decades. And the kind of other element that was hit there by this article was, in fact, the importance of DoD funding to space. And it's totally understandable, and we in the commercial servicing space believe in a business proposition that says DoD can be one of a number of customers using these services. General Shaw talked about the importance of national security and commercial industry working more closely together in this sort of new era of space. He called it kind of the third era of space. And I think a piece of that is recognizing that the threat environment the DoD assets are facing today in orbit has emerged more rapidly than the commercial market for most servicing. Not all servicing. There's on-orbit servicing demand today from some particular geo operators. But in general, a lot of the demand is still emerging. And so the role that DoD can play, both to secure the capabilities they need today to support the warfighter, protect their assets that are needed for the warfighter, but also to accelerate the development of the commercial market, that will lead to the happy day when DoD can sort of buy services on demand to augment their own capabilities. Both of these require DoD funding. It is not the case that the end state of a sort of fully commercial market is going to magically appear, and DoD funding and that being predictable and well articulated to investors is really critical.
And I want to bring in a real world example, Jack. If you could talk about Astroscale's, I guess you call it a fly around mission last year with the what was it, Japanese second stage launch vehicle. If you could just if you could talk about that mission and then maybe discuss how that, something like that type of capability of close proximity movement can be applied, or how the DoD can use that technology.
No, absolutely. So Astroscale US, US company, as I said, incorporated in Nevada, headquartered in Denver. We've got about 100 folks working for us here in the United States with our own board of directors working under a DoD proxy so that all foreign ownership issues are mitigated. We can work with the DoD, and the DoD is comfortable with that. We're part of a broader global group, and the Astroscale Japan entity, funded by the Japanese government, did a mission called Address J, which was a close inspection of an upper rocket body, and really incredible close approximation and sensing to understand that piece of big space debris, right? And the Japanese government was so happy with that, they're following that up with a second mission that will actually deorbit that, get that big piece of junk out of the orbits before it breaks up and causes additional space debris and threatens in-orbit assets. So really positive, exciting thing. The sensors and the ability to do that close approximation that Address J demonstrated is key to any docking, life extension, maneuvering of assets that kind of the core of on-orbit servicing. It also demonstrated the ability for in-orbit situational awareness on a taskable servicer to augment what we know on the ground. So in the world of increasing competition in the orbits, a higher threat environment, the ability to have assets in space that when there's an anomaly or something that our national security customer doesn't understand, to be able to actually task that and go take a look. What exactly is available? What is that doing? This is a brand new capability that is being demonstrated commercially and can be available to DoD, in a range of things. It could be an entirely DoD tasked satellite. It could be a commercial service that they buy time on. But I think it really underscored where we're going in terms of on-orbit servicing being relevant to the warfighter.
Jack, if I could just jump in briefly, I just wanted to follow on with something, stealing a little bit from General Shaw's, talk and thinking about one of the things that he highlighted, which is, the Venn diagram of on-orbit commercial servicing and other applications. It's not a perfect circle, right? It doesn't fully overlap. There are going to be adjacent capabilities, but what Jack from Astroscale was just mentioning is exactly kind of like what we see. The government has a role, and specifically as we talk about the U.S. government and focus on U.S. DoD missions, there's a role there for investing in technologies that serve national security missions that creates technology that then really plays well into de-risking and creating the necessary capability for a robust commercial market. And so that's how and I'm speaking only on Benchmark's behalf here, not the Astroscale, not anyone else on the panel, but for us specifically, when we see investments by the DoD into things that are maybe not directly aligned with what you would consider on-orbit servicing, but it allows us to de-risk, get flight heritage, train people on technologies that we can then play in. Like, the government's not necessarily laying all of the breadcrumbs to a fully commercial on-orbit servicing capability, but they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So in addition to the other pieces, the obvious ones see it, creating the regulatory environment, creating the long-term plan, I think they have a real role to play, and that's been our experience in what they've been doing.
And Steve, there's one frustration that a lot of companies have when working with the DoD is sometimes the DoD has a massive budget and the Space Force has a massive budget, but often funding allocated for a project or to a company will only go so far, maybe only on maybe a ground demo or paper engineering or something like that. How do you bridge the gap between that? And what are your thoughts on getting to more full scale in orbit demonstrations and creating, maybe Jack said it, but a sense of certainty in funding for a program to continue in a sustainable way?
Yeah, we commonly refer to this as how do you bridge the valley of death, right? Between kind of some early prototype systems and then getting to kind of a full up and fully funded and stable program of record. One of the challenges I think here with space mobility, and it was kind of highlighted at the conference as well, is just really pinning down, what you mean. Jack and Ryan just talked about some really cool applications that would kind of fall into this catch-all bucket of servicing, assembly, manufacturing, logistics. We talked a little bit about on-orbit refueling, talked a little bit about rendezvous and proximity operations. There's so many neat things that you can do, and this technology is developing so quick. The challenge then comes back on the Department of Defense or other government customers of specifically defining those requirements and what you need to do. And those requirements are usually the baseline justification of getting to some of those larger programs of record and having some of that longer term budget stability. So the military requirements really might be something very different than just your commercial requirements. There was an analogy brought up last week at the conference that I liked. It was talking about aerial refueling. There's really nothing stopping a commercial, civil aircraft from being able to go out there and to do aerial refueling if it's trying to get all the way across the world. But the way that our airport infrastructure has evolved has not made that a necessary thing to do, as it also requires more risk of two aircraft meeting up in the middle of the air and transferring fuel. But that is a very unique military requirement, and militaries all around the world want to be able to refuel their bombers and their fighter jets, and that's a critical part of kind of air power dominance that a lot of our allies and partners have, right? So there very well could be kind of those military unique aspects that might not have that wider commercial space applications. And in order for the government to really pin those down and have those programs of record, they're going to have to formalize more and more of those requirements. So I think one of the ways that you do that is just have continuous collaboration and coordination between government and industry. Folks in the government need to just understand the latest and greatest technology and what's happening. And sometimes it's not just a technology demonstration. Sometimes it's, hey, we're able to take advantage of some severe, cost reductions. Maybe something was cost prohibitive in the past, but maybe it's a lot more reasonable these days for the rapid advances that we're seeing in space technology. So I think that dialogue is key of understanding the kind of current state of play, and that helps those requirements that eventually kind of turns into those longer term, more stable programs of record.
Jack, if I could jump in on that, because I think Steve is really describing a key dynamic here. There have been successful initiatives in Space Force to explore a more rapid contracting, rapid delivery approach. We, for example, are building a refueler for Space Force. First time that's been done at the scale we're doing, very much under that dynamic, right? 2 years from contract to delivery. In the world of space, that's pretty amazing. And it adds an additional capability to Space Force in addition to, for rapid response, in addition to sort of the classic sort of exquisite solutions that DoD will probably also continue to need. Building on that and doing that more routinely is, I think, really critical, and finding funding mechanisms. That's what gets you over the valley of death, right? Then you're not funding people's development. You're actually buying capabilities that you need quickly. And that dynamic, we're hearing about that, I think, from the new administration. We know people in Space Force are thinking really hard about that. This is a really important part of the equation to get right.
And Ryan, you have a very unique perspective on this industry, being a supplier into a number of different applications. If you were putting your DoD procurement hat on, what are some maybe subsectors really that you would think need investing, both because of the capabilities necessary and maybe you'd like to see a little extra push from the help of the DoD?
That's a big question. I would say, I won't get into like all of the nitty gritty. I mean, there's some like obvious ones, like semiconductors and all that. Like that's boring. But I think, as we see this transition, there's been this whole discussion. I mean, this topic of this panel, but also the topic of the conference, right, on dynamic space operations. What does that actually mean, and where does that fit? And so, Jack just kind of mentioned, Steve mentioned, there needs to be continued investment and push into it's software, sensing, and actuators, and usually that's propulsion, but there's also related pieces. I mean, there is a lot of work to be done there around like space situational awareness. How do you process all of that data, and how do you kind of tie everything together? Again, kind of cribbing from the conference and stuff that General Shaw mentioned, like this idea of moving from positional space assets, things that are fixed in space, obviously they're orbiting, but fixed in their orbit, to things that are going to be maneuvering around, and where is that going to put a lot of pressure? Obviously I'm coming from the propulsion side of it. We want to see continued investment there. But in all seriousness, if you're going to move to an environment where not all assets, but important assets need to be more dynamic, think about all of the pieces of the supply chain that require investment, that need to be able to work together. Where are we? How do we get from point A to point B? And what are the actual steps that need to make that happen? And, there's a lot of great work going on the ground. There's a lot of baby steps in space in terms of flight heritage, and, tons of thrusters have done maneuvers in space, but doing them in a dynamic way, in a closed loop. We're going to operate autonomously, avoid hazards, rendezvous with maybe a cooperative or non-cooperative asset, and help fix it. That's a much smaller subset of people that have done that. If we're going to have a robust ecosystem, I think we need to continue to see investment into that. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that in small ways, and we also, Jack mentioned this, Steve mentioned this, we also expect and are seeing all of the signs or signals that that's going to continue to increase over the next few years.
And Steve, does the how does the new administration play into all of this over the next couple of years? You have DOGE, which could be a reduction in budgets and then you also have kind of a mentality of commercialization and increasing prioritization of space national security.
No, I think you hit it right on the nose there, Jack, because space has never been more as important as it is today for especially the joint warfighter if we're talking about national security space and the Department of Defense. And that demand for different space capabilities is only going to be increasing. So as more folks are familiar with what space brings to the fight, everything from communications to positioning, navigation, and timing to missile warning, all of those things are just going to be in higher demand kind of moving forward. The other big picture aspect that we're dealing with here is we have the space sector is going through a really transformational technological change, right? Launch costs have been steadily decreasing the last few years, which has traditionally been a big bottleneck for space systems. You have the ability now, as we've kind of been talking about, to potentially service or refuel satellites in orbit that can extend their operational life or give them new capabilities, allow them to be more dynamic, as we were talking about. We have components, that are shrinking down, and new technologies like artificial intelligence that's also just transforming the way that we're looking at space data. So putting all that context in mind, I think it's going to be really important for the next administration or this administration to really be able to focus on explaining what space's impact across the joint force, especially, right? Ryan talked a lot about aspects of some of the supply chain challenges. Last couple of years, we've seen some supply chain investments that are unique to space. And as we see, satellite constellations scale up to thousands of satellites, what used to only be, a handful of satellites, when we see launch vehicles, increase in the number and cadence that are launching there, it's going to be critical to make sure that especially the federal government is aware of some of these supply chain bottlenecks and to make strategic investments to make sure that we can depend on space for future national security needs.
Yeah, Jack, maybe we could talk. We mentioned your the mission you guys had last year, but any kind of near-term technological advancements that you guys are super excited about? It was I don't know how the inspection was within maybe 15 meters of the spacecraft, Jack, or is there plans for, what's the movement on actually latching on to a spacecraft or satellite debris?
Right. I mean, I think showing the state of the art, in and of itself was a really dramatic, positive thing. More broadly, when you think about the transformations that are going on in the space industry, one of the things that's probably new is that there's a lot of developments on the commercial industry that can be brought into DoD. You don't have to start and build from scratch an exquisite system. So, for example, we're building a commercial life extension servicer here in the US. So that's being built, our own IRAD, our skin in the game, building that for the commercial market, right? To go up and extend the life of geostationary commercial satellites. That's already commercially proven, and those operators really understand their business cases. So it's, in some respects, it's a new segment, but it's not an exploratory segment, commercial. The capabilities that are developed to do that, whether it's the close approximation, the docking, the software required for that, the mission ops, or the build itself, the logistics chain, all of that developed for that kind of commercial application can be brought into a DoD program. It's why, for example, we were able to bid and win on the refueler for rapid build, rapid delivery, because we had that experience. I think that similarly, that solution, DoD doesn't do life extension of its servicers. That's not a requirement they have. But they do have a requirement for maneuver, and the same capabilities that can allow for life extension can approach and grapple and move an asset that is being approached by an unfriendly alternative asset, for example. So DoD is now in the position where not only are the things they invest in themselves, but the things that commercial industry invests in can be relevant to their requirements. And I think General Shaw made the point at the conference how important it is that national security and commercial operators really are more closely aligned, really understand the requirements and the emerging technology. I mean, I think Ryan was talking about that. That virtuous cycle is really important here as commercial industry shows off its new capabilities in purely commercial missions. But I think the fact that those missions can create and prove out capabilities relevant to DoD is what adds a new, more agile capability to national security sort of bag of tricks.
Ryan, were you at? I don't know if you were at the conference. Were you at Space Mobility?
I wasn't there, but we had people there, and so
or maybe, yeah. How would you say the definition of resilience has changed over the last couple of years, and what do you get the sense? How do you think the DoD defines it now?
Well, I think, I mean, there are a couple of specific things. I know a big topic, I mean, again, all the reporting and also our on the ground is around launch resilience. Maybe I'll kick that to Steve or someone who's a little bit more on that side of it. But specifically, as we see it, just resilience kind of more broadly is this kind of combination of, market resilience combined with, which is actually, I mean, that kind of encompasses everything, right? So like that's a little bit of the supply chain resilience. We don't need to belabor it. I know it's an exhausting topic. Everyone's kind of bored with talking about it. It's still not fully solved, but I think there's a lot of been investment and there's a lot of progress being made there. But I think also, this idea, and again, kind of harping back to something I said earlier, and then other people on the panel have said as well, because it's so important. This idea that the government does not want to have to be in a position where they are picking winners, fully funding, all of these capabilities. And so they really want to see that you are demonstrating a business case, that there is more than one person who is out there. They are able to fund their business. And so when we propose on on any projects, whether that's commercial or government, that's a conversation that we're frequently having. What does your customer base look like? How resilient are they? There was a lot of very VC funded or SPAC funded companies that, there were like some dips over the past 18 months that created a lot of concern about the viability, right, of any individual organization. So I think that resilience, that as we see it, is really around this idea of, are you going to be there in the future to help support us? And I think specific to this topic, again, I think launch was one that they really focused on. So like I said, I'll kick that to maybe someone else on the panel who might be able to speak to that part of it better.
Yeah, maybe just kind of picking up on that. I almost saw the conference as really kind of redefining resiliency. Resiliency has just been a term we've been using in national security space for many years now. Very broad, all-encompassing term, but because there was such a strong, especially launch focus happening at the Space Mobility Conference, a lot of discussion about like what resiliency means in this new context. I think Ryan just kind of talked a bit about market resiliency is not only supply chain pieces, right, but also making sure that you have a competitive market out there, that you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket for one company, but making sure that there's a healthy kind of resilient supply chain with a bunch of healthy competition, which ends up driving down costs for the government and providing new technological breakthroughs. The launch resiliency in particular, there's a lot of discussion about making sure that we aren't putting all of our eggs in one basket for a particular launch site. The vast majority of launches that happen today happen in our eastern and western ranges in Florida and California, even though we do see some launch happening out of Virginia and then also out of Alaska. But in the future, if we want to make sure we have that assured access to space, we want to make sure that there's other options that are happening. Last thing that you want to have happen is some sort sort of a natural disaster, something like a hurricane, or maybe even something from an adversary like a cyber attack, take a major launch site offline and really cripple our access to being able to get those very important payloads to orbit. So a lot of questions about making sure that infrastructure investments are done for our launch infrastructure and spaceports, similar to how we've made strategic investments as a nation into ports in the maritime domain and airports as well. That also house, commercial and military, traffic. So I think that was an important piece. And there's, a big calls for just, again, kind of some of those strategic investments, recognizing where those national security bottlenecks are and maybe vulnerabilities are, and making sure that there's extra resiliency across the board.
Yeah, Steve, and building on that, I think sort of the next big leap on resiliency is the recognition that adding in-orbit servicing capability is a part of supporting assured access to space. It adds an additional element of resilience if you can do real-time tasking of inspectors, if you can be guaranteed that you can move satellites out of the way of unfriendly approaches, if you can improve sustainment of satellites so they can take unplanned movements without using up the fuel they need for their basic missions. These are all things that discourage bad behavior and increase the resilience of the national security assets. And I think that wasn't so much a focus of the conference, but I think, as Steve said, it was really very much launch focus, which is kind of like the first thing you have to get right. But it actually is sort of that next generation of, on-orbit servicing is resilience.
And Ryan, what are you seeing from a orbit transfer vehicle kick stage domain?
We're seeing strong commercial and government demand. I think one of the things that that there's been renewed interest in is now that we're starting to see some of the capabilities come online, the launch vehicles in different size classes, and this emphasis on tactically responsive space, right? This idea of how do we access different orbits quickly. One of the key ways that you can do that is have a variety of launch vehicles that you can launch from, and have the ability to take any given orbit and put your asset into a different orbit, right? So if you're launching into LEO, can you put something into GEO? Can you do plane changes? All these different pieces. So strong government demand. The commercial demand has always been developing. I mean, and it continues to develop. Our customers are out there actively working on things, and actually we should have some announcements on that coming up soon. So thanks for teeing it up.
Yeah, cool. Great. And then Jack, how about on some headwinds? Besides, we talked a lot about the supply chain, so maybe besides the headwinds, besides manufacturing, and besides kind of a execution risk, which I always find to be a cop-out answer. What are some headwinds that you see in this sector, in the space mobility sector?
Well, Astroscale sort of has always had the view that bringing the promise of on-orbit servicing to life requires, great technology. It requires getting policy right, and it requires business cases to close, right? And we work on all three of them as we do the refueler. We're looking at that, even though that's a longer-term, market development. We're doing the life extensions servicer that we're building, very much working on all three of those. I think today, the technology and the policy, although it's not all locked down, there seems to be a lot of goodwill, particularly on the policy side, for regulators to work with companies and governments to get these missions up in space. So that's great. Eventually, that will need to be scaled, but for what's happening right now, it's working pretty well. So this question of business case, and particularly this question that we talked about earlier, aligning the DoD's more urgent requirements and the longer term promise of building out the commercial market. For DoD to get the services they're going to want 10 years from now, they're going to have to incentivize them today. And that really gets to this how do you help companies cross the valley of death? An awful lot of the relatively limited money that DoD is spending is going into individual technology development, and we're totally in favor of that. But bringing that technology together into an integrated mission that delivers actually a warfighter impact is what DoD needs for itself today, and to stimulate the kind of market investment that it's looking to have so that it can buy these things in the future.
Great. So we have around 10 minutes left in the webinar. I think that's a good segue to talking about the future, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years down the line. But what are some, I guess, how would you envision space mobility evolving in 10 years? What kind of applications and once we can get over these technical hurdles, how do you see it looking? Steve, I can toss that to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing I hope that we have solved in 10 years is some of that regulatory certainty. Jack just kind of spoke a little bit about this, but in order to do some of these very kind of creative, never been done before at scale types of missions, especially if there isn't a particular government satellite involved, you're going to have to understand what those limitations are, and there has to be a regulatory process that businesses understand and can count on for doing some of these types of missions. Anything from a deorbit to a refueling to even a on-orbit inspection. Right now, there are some challenges with that. And so, hoping in the future that, Congress will act and make sure that they can provide some of that regulatory framework and stability, that companies know, which government agency to go to if they have a desire to do a certain type of mission, how long it's going to take to get some regulatory approval, and from the government perspective, making sure they can understand what those risks are, right? And making sure that as they're analyzing new and novel types of activities, that they're not overly regulating them to the point that it's not going to be commercially feasible.
Right. Ryan, I'll ask you the same question on 10 years down the road. How do you envision the space mobility market evolving?
Yeah, I think everyone knows launch costs are falling, right? And so there's going to be some amount of assets that are still thought of as disposable or whatever. But even with falling launch costs, there are assets that we put up there that we want as a nation, as a company, to be able to maintain, upgrade, maneuver, move it around to avoid things. And so I think the things that we see that we're really interested in are idea like modular propulsion, right? The idea of build the satellite, be able to adjust the propulsion. So whether that's on orbit or on the ground, we are really interested in the idea of storable or warehousable propulsion and other upgrades, similar upgrades, right? Can you change your sensor suite? Can you upgrade your avionics? If we're worried about solar panel damage, can you replace those pieces? Again, some assets you're going to want, we launch it, it does its mission, and it comes down. But as the assets increase in value, what we see in general, right, when costs fall, that doesn't just make things cheaper, it gives us more access to do more capable things. So there are going to be bigger, more interesting satellites up there, and we're really interested in all of the pieces that support that. What does that mean to have some assets that are worth upgrading, worth servicing, worth refueling, worth maneuvering, and we're interested in the places that we can help to support that.
Yeah, it becomes even more relevant when you have a Starship that can take a ton once they eventually start deploying customer payloads. They can deploy a ton of spacecraft, but at a very specific orbit, and maybe at a lower orbit or higher orbit than one would need, and it kind of brings in that need for orbit for in-space mobility and space tugs to bring that last mile and move it around.
Yep.
And Jack, I'll ask you the same question too about that 10 years down the road. What kind of technology and applications do you envision proliferating?
I think we look forward at Astroscale US to the day when we have fleets of servicers delivering a full range of services. The kind of thing that Ryan was describing, right? Some might be multi-mission, able to do multiple things. Some may be highly specialized, a broader range of sustainment and maintenance activities, all taskable in real time, so they're highly agile. That world, enabled by lower launch costs, but at the same time, a world where people don't want to pay the gravity tax twice, right? You put something into orbit, and then you get as much out of it as is possible. That kind of world, I think, is the basis for a lot of broader aspirations for crewed space flight around the orbits and beyond. So that world also will deliver the kind of resilience that is necessary for warfighters to be able to carry out their missions, and that's kind of the key goal for all of this. Is a real overlap between what the warfighter needs and what the commercial market can benefit from, and not just in terms of DoD funding, but more broadly in terms of building that on-orbit ecosystem.
Yeah, I think Ryan and both Ryan and Jack, you guys made good points about just how we don't know what we don't know, but what we do know is that these Starship and New Glenn are going to come online, and applications are going to change, and things will get bigger, costs will decline, innovation will increase, and the capabilities that a satellite operator, or it can be a space station, humans in space, what we can put into space will be very different than what even we can imagine now. And as the complexity increases, then you can start, servicing and interacting in space rather than just having a very binary terrestrial to space route, which I think is very fascinating. I do want, before we leave everybody, I want to get everyone's the best way to contact you guys. Is it LinkedIn or email? Jack, what do you prefer?
Yeah, no, LinkedIn is good.
Okay,
and also, I respond to email pretty well as well. So I don't know, Jack, if you're going to sort of put our contact information in, but happy to do follow up. This has been a great discussion, and I think we've hit on a lot of the key themes. You could go in a lot more directions. I do want to just comment one question in the chat. Someone was asking about California. There's actually a great space event in California, in Silicon Valley this week, the SmallSat conference. So check that out. And yes, we very much benefit from the excitement on the West Coast for aerospace developments, and rely on that.
And
Great.
And then for contact, definitely feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on our website, aia-aerospace.org. You should see my full bio and email address and ways to get in contact with me.
And Ryan?
Yeah, LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn, go to our page. You can see some of the new announcements that we're going to be talking about soon. And, email's good as well. So whatever works best.
All right, guys, this has been really awesome. I appreciate your time. Really interesting conversation. If you're in the audience and you want to reach out to one of them, seems like LinkedIn is the best, or via their websites. But very fun conversation. Appreciate the time, guys.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Jack.